presentation is about the Australian experience with carbon pricing, and there's a very deep philosophical debate going on at the moment as the carbon tax system gets dismantled over the next few months. And the debate is broken into two sides. There's one side which says, and the supporters of the approach that Australia took is, an imperfect carbon policy in the short run is better than no short run policy. It can be fixed over time. So the policy that was designed in Australia, from my point of view, was full of incredible flaws and was inevitably going to die. My view then is that a flawed short-run policy will destroy effective long-term policy because it will collapse and it will poison the policy ground. There will be no carbon pricing in Australia of any effective measure for some period in the future as a result of the carbon tax as it was designed. There's a long political history behind what happened. Most of it, in terms of the carbon pricing, occurred between 2010 and 2012. And to get the political context right, there was an election in 2007. A Prime Minister ran with the goal of ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, which was done to lead the world in climate policy design, to go off to the Copenhagen summit and to save the planet. Now, when that failed, when there was no agreement on binding commitments, the Prime Minister became very depressed and decided that the great moral challenge of our time, which was his platform for running for office, was no longer really relevant. And so he basically decided to back away from a carbon pricing system. There was a coup in a political sense. A new Prime Minister came to power, Prime Minister Gillard. She went to the election promising no carbon tax. She won the election, and then she had to form a coalition with the Green Party, who wanted a carbon tax. And the problem was that the Green Party then held the balance of power in the Senate. There was a coalition between the left Labor Party and the Greens, and they went to design a policy. Now, the context here, and this may not be true of Green parties generally, but I would argue in Australia, the view of the Green Party is not that carbon pricing is a good idea because it changes behaviour. Carbon pricing is a good idea because it destroys industries. Now, if that's the case, you need to have the highest possible carbon price because Australia is a very fossil fuel intensive economy, and to close down the electricity coal production, which is 80% of our electricity production, you needed a very high carbon price. So the Greens came from a position of the highest possible. The government, which was a Labor government, which was supported by the union movement, had a lot of very energy-intensive unionists who were very upset with the idea that their industries would be closed. So that's the context. And what came out was a process designed by committee, where the committee consisted of politicians and community advocates, and I would argue almost no input from experts in the room. There were some very good people like Frank Yotso who were advising from the outside, and there were other economists, but really this was a policy designed by a committee of non-experts. So what did the failed government policy look like? Well, it was set up in a context of already having quite significant subsidies to renewable energy. The MRET, the mandatory renewable energy target, was already in place from 2001. So there was a lot of support for renewable industry, but in a context of a country that had an enormous endowment of fossil fuels. You really needed to have significant subsidies to try and reach the target of a 20% of electricity generation produced by renewable energies by 2020. So what was the policy? And what's ironic here is you can't just say this was the policy because it needs a little t. The policy was changing every day or every week, and this was creating enormous problems. But the sort of broad policy was the idea of a carbon tax at $23 a tonne beginning in July 2012, rising at an interest rate to reach $25.40 per tonne in 2014-15. It would then switch to a cap and trade market in July 2015. Now, the initial proposal had a price ceiling of $20 per tonne above the world price. Now, it made absolutely no sense because why would you have a price ceiling that was higher than the world price in a market that you could trade in the world market? It also had a price floor, and again, I'd written extensively, and Frank Yotso was a big proponent of having this price floor at $15 a tonne. Frank succeeded for a small period of time. This was subsequently dropped, and it was replaced by the promise that instead of a price floor, we would allow permits to be imported from the European trading system up to 50% of emission abatement. So we basically changed the rules as the thing was designed. And there was a lot of compensation. In fact, ex post, there was more compensation by orders of magnitude than the tax itself. So we, in Australia, demonstrated that you can raise a carbon tax and worsen the fiscal position at the same time, which was quite a feat. There was a lot of allocation of the permits, but the big problem was there were big changes in cash transfers and tax cuts to households. The idea here was twofold. Let's deal with climate change, and let's deal with a fundamental redistribution of income in the economy. So there were, again, too many instruments, too many targets, not enough instruments. The second problem was all of the compensation design wasn't based on actual revenue, it was based on forecasts. Forecasts of revenue, forecasts of carbon prices, forecasts of a global agreement in 2014 in which there would be a world carbon price of $35 a tonne. How do you assess this? So looking at it before it was implemented, I was quite critical, and my main criticism was one of robustness. This policy might work if you got the forecast right. But what could go wrong? And I'll just give you some ideas what might go wrong. It could well be that by 2014 or 2015, the world would not have an international agreement. And so there wouldn't be this large stock of carbon credits that we could use to bring into Australia. If we couldn't trade permits from overseas and we had a cap and trade system, because of the emission profile in the country, we could have a very high carbon price in Australia. So there was no ceiling price except for this idea of a world price. But in fact, this was a real problem of exposing a fossil fuel intensive economy to a major shock. The second possibility was that suppose there was an international agreement, but the carbon price was sitting around $15 a tonne, because what if the world had a recession? And as it turns out, the world did have a recession. So we would have a system where the price would go up to $25.40 per tonne, and then the next day on July the 1st, 2015, it would drop by almost 50%. So the asset valuations that this would cause, revaluations, would be quite substantial. Then, by allowing the European permits to come in, what if the price in the European permits actually weren't $25 a tonne, but actually fell to $5 or $6 a tonne? Then the price drop would be about 80%. Very bad policy design. You took an optimal policy, which was to have a carbon price that went like this, and you turned it into a policy where the carbon price went like this. Very high short-term costs to industry and no potential future price. It was completely wrong. Third possibility that might go wrong is that there is a global market, everything works beautifully, and Australia decides to start trading permits. The trouble was, renewable energy does not have a comparative advantage in Australia, so we were going to build an industry which we would then destroy once we had a carbon trading system, because instead of producing domestically with renewables, we just buy permits from offshore. And so we'd have this infant industry argument which would destroy billions of dollars of wealth. And the other risks, as I mentioned, compensation was based on forecasts, not permits, and the risk to the fiscal position was real. The revenue was depending on the actual price, but the compensation was based on the carbon price. So what was the implications of the design of this system? Enormous uncertainty in the long-term investment opportunities for abatement. So people would not invest in renewables. They wouldn't change the way they did things because they didn't know what the carbon price would be on July 1st, 2015. And in fact, most companies took the option of investing in lobbyists instead of investing in alternative energy for reducing emissions. And they succeeded, actually. It was a good investment. So what was the basic problem with the government's approach? Well, there was no long-term carbon price. If there was one, it was zero. There was no long-term carbon market, so there was no way for industry to hedge their long-term investments. There were so many exclusions that the distortions that were put in place meant patchy coverage. And there was enormous investment uncertainty, and we took a climate risk and we put it into a fiscal risk, which in the context of what's happening in Europe and the US is not very big because we have very little government debt in Australia, but nonetheless, you didn't need to do that. So what did go wrong? So I've talked about what might go wrong and what I was concerned about. What did go wrong? Well, firstly, they kept changing the policy. The lobbyists would come in, the unionists would come in, the policy changed on a regular basis. Coincidentally, between 2009 and 2014, electricity prices rose 110%. not because of the carbon price. By 2012-13, the carbon price was roughly 16% of a household electricity bill. It was because the way energy was generated and distributed in Australia, there's a lot of government regulatory control and government corporations and very poor investment decisions, so there was a bottleneck problem and the price of electricity escalated. They threw away the floor price very quickly. As soon as they saw the European price begin to decline, they decided to make it a lot cheaper if we actually imported the permits from overseas, and then all of a sudden the European carbon price collapsed. The Australian dollar rose up to $1.10 US, and the pricing mechanism was in Australian dollars. So in US dollars, the input costs for carbon rose really quite dramatically, probably the highest carbon price in the world. And as a result of other shocks, energy-intensive industry began to close. Now, that wasn't surprising. I was involved in the modelling behind this together with Treasury, and we had a substantial decline in emissions coming from relocation out of energy-intensive industries. So we knew aluminium production would be hurt. We knew the auto industry would be hurt. These things happened more quickly than the model suggested, and so we had a problem. Sure, that's good. There was also a fiscal problem emerged because, again, we were having a commodity price boom, and the forecast of Treasury was that this would last for a very long time and the revenues would be rushing into Treasury. But as the world economy went into recession, as nominal income growth fell, the revenue base generally in the economy began to collapse. So we had a situation where we thought we had lots of money to spend on all sorts of grand plans, but in fact, the fiscal position had swung dramatically. So that led to the point where there was an election, the carbon tax was seen as one of the key issues. The new government came in promising to ditch the tax, and it hasn't happened yet because the Senate is now controlled by still the same Senate as we had under the previous government. It's a very interesting, complicated system we have. But July 1st, the new Senate comes in, and instead of the balance of power being held by the left, the balance of power is now being held by the extreme right. So we have this interesting political dynamic where the tax may not actually be able to be removed from the system, but one hopes that they can redesign it at least. So what's the new policy? The new policy of the new right-wing government is still to keep energy subsidies for renewables, but they're reviewing that, and there's a good chance that that will change. And effectively, the government's policy is not to use carbon pricing directly, but to pay industry to reduce emissions in a voluntary basis. So if you've got an idea, you go to the government, they'll pay, and you can reduce your emissions, and they will pay for it. Now, the problem with this approach, of course, is that this type of strategy is unlikely to reduce emissions at low cost because there's an enormous number of low-cost abatement opportunities that aren't captured by not having a carbon price. So the problem with the current government policy is very similar to the problem with the previous policy. There is no long-term carbon price. There is no long-term carbon market. You've got increased uncertainty because people don't know what will happen when the carbon price is abolished, if it is abolished. You've also got this risk in the fiscal balance instead of being a compensation risk. And by the way, all the compensation is still being spent. Even if the carbon tax gets removed, the compensation will not get removed. So even though you had a short window of 2 years of revenue, you don't have that opportunity if you abolish the tax. And the big problem, of course, is what if we have to do more? It's very hard to scale up a policy that Australia's implemented where you pay for abatement. So let me sum up. The climate policy debate in Australia has been badly damaged because of bad policy design. If you didn't think it was bad policy design before my presentation, I assume you're more aware of some of the flaws in the system. There are two groups of economists in Australia. There are those who are involved in designing it, who've hung on to the very end, saying it cannot be as bad as it looks like the political process will make it. My view is that it was inevitable given this way it was put together. You weren't constraining through long-term assets the behaviour of future governments. So there's a saying, and this has been levied directly at me actually by the former Secretary of Treasury, and that is, and actually I think Gibb quoted this to me last night completely independently, and that is this argument, perfection is the enemy of the good. This would have worked if you hadn't just shut up and allowed us to go ahead and implement a policy which was third best, but over time it would have become second best and then it would have become first best. So that's an open debate, and this is a legitimate position to hold. My position is actually bad policy design based on politics will eventually destroy any policy. So to me, that's the lesson from the Australian experience. You've got to get the design right, and it's got to be done in a way which is a lot of expert input, and you've got to sell the message to the political constituencies out there rather than let the narrow interests dominate the debate. And I will stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much.